As someone with Asperger's, that means I have a great many interests in life. One of those I hold particularly close to my heart is my love of trains. You can blame Thomas the Tank Engine for that. Harry Potter, on the other hand, not so much, though I still have a bit of an appreciation for it. Hell, I'm even reading and contributing to a massive crossover fan fiction about Harry Potter. And in one of those contributions, I delved into a bit of the history of the Hogwarts Express. You see, as it is in canon, the Hogwarts Express is a bit broken, and I decided to fix it. So, what is the canon backstory for the Hogwarts Express? Well, in 1827, the Minister for Magic, Ottoline Gambol, made a controversial decision to acquire a Muggle steam locomotive and its carriages to transport Hogwarts' student body to and from the school, bringing about an end to centuries of the students taking whatever way they fancied to the school, whether it be by commandeering enchanted carts, or flying magical creatures, or taking broomsticks. However, all these various aforementioned methods could potentially attract the attention of the Muggles, which, given the statute of secrecy, is not something the magical world would really have wanted. Gambol decided that in order to combat this age-old problem, acquisition of a Muggle steam locomotive provided the most inconspicuous and comfortable means of getting to and from the school without having to rely on a mass use of port keys, which can be incredibly uncomfortable. And so in 1830 an operation was undertaken to acquire an engine from Crew Works. A station sprang up overnight in the town of Hogsmeade, and a platform was built specifically for the express at King's Cross Station, the iconic platform 9 3/4. From this point until its first appearance in the Philosopher's Stone, there's been no explicit mention of whether or not the express has been modified or anything, if it's supposedly in its original state. And if it is supposedly in its as-built state, then that leaves a handful of problems, because actually it can't exist in its original state, because it didn't exist. Wait, let me try and get to where I'm going with this, shall I? The Express has always been represented as a great big red tender engine. In the films, it was represented by a Great Western Railway 4900 class 460 tender engine, also known as a Hall class locomotive, specifically number 5972 Alton Hall. This is where we meet our first problem, in that Alton Hall was built in April 1937, and indeed the Hall class as a whole was built between 1928 and 1943. Even the oldest Hall class locomotive would be 99 years too young for it to be the locomotive stolen by the Ministry of Magic. So the age of the class is a problem, and then there's the whole issue of how it appears, because it is at oldest a 1928 locomotive, not one from 1830. Now, in case you're not aware, trains were only just starting to become something in the 1820s. They'd been around since 1804-ish, but they were really starting to kick off in the 1820s. And one of the most famous early steam engines was Robert Stephenson's Rocket, which was built in 1829, 1 year before the Hogwarts Express was acquired. I shall now remind you of what Rocket looked like. Yeah, that doesn't look like the Hogwarts Express to me. Yes, trains in the 1820s and 1830s were rather rickety looking things compared to the great big mechanical marvels we know today. So, the type of locomotive it is too young, not just in build date, but also in its how it looks. What else is wrong? Well, the fact that it was stolen from Crewe Works in 1830, which is really quite remarkable. It goes to show just how amazing these magical people are, because Crewe Works didn't open until 1840. And then there's Platform 9 and 3/4. They started running from King's Cross almost immediately, I believe, in 1830, which is even more remarkable than what they did with Crewe Works, because King's Cross didn't open until 1852, as with the rest of the East Coast Main Line. Look, I'm not faulting J.K. Rowling for this inaccuracies. I mean, I doubt she's a rail fan. She probably just looked up a few words and things and decided, yeah, this will do. That's a good enough explanation, and just didn't really look into the history. Like, I don't really blame her for that. Interest in trains isn't exactly universal, so I decided to sort of take it upon myself to try and fix the Hogwarts Express, and try and make it a bit more explainable, and also make it fit in a bit more to its setting, the East Coast Main Line up to Scotland. So the first issue is the locomotive itself, as stated previously, represented by a GWR Hall class locomotive, which didn't exist at the time, and simply is the wrong region. GWR operated almost exclusively in the western part of the country, hence the name. Wales, Cornwall, Devon, all the way to Penzance, pretty much. Now sure, the Magicals could have stolen a Great Western engine. There's nothing really that could have stopped them, but GWR ran on a completely different track gauge to pretty much the rest of the country. They ran on 2120mm gauge, also known as broad gauge or Brunel 7-foot gauge, whilst most of the rest of the country switched to 1435mm standard gauge. In fact, broad gauge was abolished in 1892, and the only place you find broad gauge rails anymore are on heritage tracks, where it's been specifically laid down for replica broad gauge types. Now, they still could have potentially taken an engine from Crewe Works later on, when Crewe Works was actually open. I mean, I think GWR did occasionally go to Crewe, but the thing is, the Hall class was built and maintained at Swindon. In fact, a great many GWR types were built and maintained at Swindon. Crewe was kind of uncharted territory. So instead, Hogwarts Express would start off as something very similar to this. This is the L&MR Planet type. L&MR stands for Liverpool to Manchester Railway, which was one of the first major railways in the country. As you can see, it's a very strange looking device, but that comes with the territory of being from the 1830s. 10 of these locomotives were manufactured, but what if maybe there was an 11th one, and that was the one that the Magicals stole and became the Hogwarts Express? But of course, it's a very, very strange, very old looking locomotive, and even though magic might be able to prolong its lifespan, it couldn't surely continue in this guise for 100 years at least, more than 100 years. Not to mention, it was quite slow, 30 miles per hour. Sure, maybe magic could make it a bit faster, but there's only so much magic can do. They can't turn it. Surely they wouldn't be able to turn it into a 200 mile per hour speed demon. But the Magicals can do something else. They could potentially brute force an upgrade into a different, later type of locomotive, using transfiguration or transmutation or something like that. I reckon after 40 or 50, maybe even 60 years of service as a planet-type locomotive, the Magicals would decide, this isn't working, we've got to try and do it better. We can't exactly acquire another locomotive. It was very difficult the first time, so instead, let's get our hands on the plans for another engine. And this second form would be a GNSR Class O 440 locomotive. Now this is more of a personal choice to keep the Express fitting into its Highlands setting. GNSR was the Great North of Scotland Railway, and was later absorbed into the LNER, or London North Eastern Railway, which is famed for its specific type locomotives like the A3 and A4. 440s are a solid type of locomotive, and although they were gradually used more for freight, they were also used for passenger service. This second guise would also later be replaced by an LMS type, keeping with the 1930s-ish aesthetic of the Hall class. I reckon a Stenier 460 would be a suitable replacement for the Class O. And I specifically went with a Class 6P Jubilee. Alternatively, a Black 5 could have been used, but those were used mostly for freight, I believe, and I don't think any of them ever wore the LMS red colour that the Jubilees tended to wear. Alternatively, it could have ended up being an LNER A3 Pacific, like the Flying Scotsman, but I felt that having it as an LMS type would be a bit more fitting, and especially because LMS types actually wore red, unlike, I think, anything LNER. Feel free to correct me on any of that, I'm not entirely sure. And this, I would propose, would be the Hogwarts Express final form. Magic would keep this engine going for quite a long time, and would also make it able to go at a much higher speed than normal, and also maybe it's a bit more fashionable, according to Magicals, I don't know. But yeah, there would be no real need to try and transmutate it into a diesel or electric, because, well, the Magicals don't really use that stuff. So that's the issue of the type of the locomotive and how to fix how old it is by having the Magicals transmutate it into various different newer forms. As for where it was stolen from, that was also stated earlier. Instead of being crew works, it would now be stolen from the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. Then there's the issue of its coaches. I'm not gonna stick around too long on this subject. Basically, they would start off as Liverpool and Manchester Railway closed coaches, the four-wheeled two-axle coaches. These would then get upgraded into potentially GNSR coaches, which are quite flat-sided, and then later into LMS flush-sided coaches like the example you're seeing on screen, which are quite similar to the British Rail Mark I coaches that are seen in the films. And I suppose there is precedence for potentially upgrading these LMS coaches into Mark Is, as long as they didn't start as Mark Is, because those are even more out of place than the Hall-class locomotive. Seriously, Mark Is were first built in the 1950s. Yikes. Then we have the whole London terminus issue, because, well, as I said earlier, King's Cross was not built until 1852, which means for about 20 years you have no suitable terminus. Well, maybe not quite, maybe for only 7 years, because in 1837 London Euston was opened. It is one of the oldest terminus stations in London. In fact, I think only London Bridge is older than Euston. Euston is the only one that's really in the right place to provide a train going north from London, as London Bridge was, well, more southwards. Because there were no railway stations in London before 1836, It gives the Hogwarts Express no real fixed terminus for about 7 years, when Euston was built. The Express would then move to King's Cross when that was built, as King's Cross would be in a much more convenient location. So Euston as a temporary terminus makes sense to me, on what I've called Platform 2.5. Yes, I have a lot of imagination, don't I? And I think that's just about it. I have now probably fixed the Hogwarts Express and made it make a bit more sense. No longer is it an out-of-place, mispainted Great Western engine hauling British Rail coaches, it's now a much more fitting, suitable LMS-type locomotive hauling LMS coaching stock that started out its life as a Liverpool and Manchester Railway Planet-type locomotive that was eventually transmutated into a GNSR Class O, and then again into an LMS 6P Jubilee. Instead of being stolen from Crew Works, which didn't exist in 1830, it was instead stolen from the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, and instead of travelling from London King's Cross all the time, which was impossible, it would instead travel from no fixed terminus until 1837, when Euston was built, and then moved to King's Cross in 1852, when King's Cross was built. So thank you for watching this video. Hopefully you can see my line of thinking on this, and hopefully you enjoyed it. Once again, thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one, and good night.